the inevitability of the office romance. And it caught my eye because this really isn't a topic that we've discussed before, but I thought that a lot of individuals would be interested in hearing a little bit more about this and how this pops up on our small business and HR consulting radar, and also provide some guidance towards the end of our conversation on considerations as a result of what small businesses may want to do to protect their business. So, gosh, the good old office romance. Joey, would you believe that in the workplace, romances actually increased during the pandemic by 6%?
Well, I could see that because if your bubble has become smaller from like a safety standpoint, you probably just look around and look at your odds and say, you know, do I want to meet the stranger on Tinder, or do I want to just get to know Jan in accounting? And I don't know. That's my thought.
Well, I mean, you're not too far off, but I would say that this figure actually caught my eye because it seems the opposite of what I actually thought would be happening when employees are working from home. Just because, when I think about office romance and perhaps how it starts, it's like, well, you're at work, maybe by yourself, you're making friends with a couple of individuals, and maybe you sit down and just have lunch with them, and it's nothing but lunch. But that those types of interactions, or perhaps going and getting your coffee, and there's people in the break room chatting, like those types of things are what really came to mind when I think about where these relationships are potentially starting. Um, but what I'm about to share, I think, will explain kind of why this is happening. And in the article, the BBC breaks it down that there was a survey that they referenced where 75% of the individuals in this survey were asked if they were okay with the idea of their colleagues dating each other, and they actually were okay with it. And the fun fact in this survey that they reference is that actually 50% of those individuals indicated that they personally had an interest in a coworker at some point. So I'm just going to pause because that's like a major jaw dropping moment.
Yeah, I think one of the first of all, I've dated someone at the same workplace many, many, many years ago. And it's fun while you're dating. It's not fun after you break up for anybody, at least from my experience. But I would imagine that you're attracted to someone because proximity factor. You're in the same organization, so you believe that some of the same things are important. There's a lot that's said about like your workplace best friend, but then maybe this just like takes it that next level where, okay, instead of complaining about our boss over coffee, we'll complain about our boss on a date. And I don't know, maybe that just brings people together. But yeah, I don't know.
Oh man, I love that example. Well, I can't say that I've ever dated anybody that I've worked with. In fact, I've taken the completely opposite approach, which is no matter how much I may even like somebody, like as a friend, that especially in an HR role, it's very, very important for me to keep a large distance of separation just in the event that, say, this individual becomes the subject of an investigation or performance issue. I don't even have to deal with like, oh man, that's my friend, or the perception that they may be favored in any sort of way. So thankfully, I'm not in that 50%, but I wanted to chat a little bit about like, why is this happening? And so referring back to the article, there's discussion about how work is continuing to take up more of our time, especially as we're starting to work from home, and kind of some of those boundaries blur. Some individuals are in many cases working longer hours just because it's easy and accessible for them. But there's two things that lay the ground for romance, and you started to talk about it. One of them are intimacy and familiarity, and the more a person sees someone or something, the more disposed they are to like it. And that's actually a psychological bias called the mere exposure effect. And you talked a little bit about proximity, but the interesting thing, Joey, is that that bias is actually not limited to proximity. So this was my aha moment, right? That even if you're on Zoom or Slack, you're still interacting with each other. And that in itself has that same effect. I was just like, oh man, we're in for, we're in for it from an HR standpoint. And so wanted to chat a little bit about, as we kind of round out this topic, like from an HR standpoint, what some of the risks are and what companies may want to consider doing about it.
Oh my goodness. The risk. Well, anytime that there is a relationship, you run the risk of domestic violence being a factor, and rearing its head in private or in public spaces in your workplace. You run the risk of one or both employees leaving. Maybe they leave for good reason and say, hey, this is really working out. And it may become a conflict down the road if we're in the same organization. Or someone may say, hey, it's I can't stay here and be around you, so I'm gonna find another place of employment. Um, Another thing to your point, Summer, when it comes to maintaining neutrality in an interview or investigation, that could come in question. I just went through a harassment training today for a board that I'm on. So sexual harassment, you know, especially if it's a situation where you have a person in authority who is getting into a relationship with someone who's a subordinate of theirs, whether directly or indirectly. Um, there's so many, many, many tricky things about this, and that's not to say you should put a guard up and not let people date. Um, but you should have some explanation, maybe even within your employee handbook, to say, if you are, we prefer that you disclose it to your supervisor and we just figure out how and if it might impact, your professional experience here at the company.
I absolutely agree. And I think the biggest one that stands out to me is the potential for the sexual harassment claims. I mean, you mentioned a variety of other challenges that can present themselves, but from a legal standpoint, I think that is the largest financial risk to the company. And what companies can do about it really is to have a policy that outlines like what behavior is acceptable and not acceptable in the organization. And very similar to any other policy in your handbook, the goal is that you ever have a situation that arises, that you refer back to the handbook and you are holding your team members accountable for their behavior, and that they're aware that there are consequences if they are not meeting the expectations that were set out for them. So some companies call them love contracts. There's a whole host of different names, but as you mentioned, Joey, it is to some degree, it's, setting expectations of behavior at various levels of detail and really just getting the commitment from the team members that if they are choosing this, that there's going to be those clear expectations, and there may be consequences for not following them.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me it's such an on the spot question. So don't you can either choose to answer this for you, or you can choose to answer this as like, well, I think the typical American would say. Maybe I'll ask it that way. Do you think the typical American would risk it all at work for love, or would they uh not risk it all and climb their career without a romance at work?
Well, I think that I mean, gosh, that is a tough question. I think that most would, and I say that because on the HR side, I've seen it happen, and I've
Uh-huh.
seen the fallout. And that's really what I'm basing that off of, is that I do think, that term, like, love is blind. I think it blinds individuals in love from a lot of things, and one of them being, kind of the risks that may be associated with being involved, specifically with somebody that they work with. I can say, from the vast majority of office romances, they don't end well. And on the HR side, it can be really, really difficult because it impacts everybody around them.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I would agree with you. I think more people would be willing to risk it, but it's not always a fairy tale. So that was our segment of while we were working. Hopefully, you've got your own fun story about either knowing someone who's dated at work, or maybe you dated at work, and maybe you're married to your work mate date, like the Obamas. The article says they met at a law firm. Let us know your story. Maybe we'll share it on air and have you and your boo on the show.